dominating this field. It's good for food science. Basically, what we're going to do today is I'm going to share with you what I see as food. And you'll see as I go along that there are many facets to food. Basically. And that's what is possibly the most interesting thing. Because when we start to look at food, our own experience is first starts at home, then it goes on to the little restaurant that our parents take us to when we are children. We understand what those varieties are. And finally, we actually go ourselves with our parents probably, and then later on by ourselves to a retail shop and buy some food. And this food is in different formats and different stages of completion. So you then get a feeling that a food is not just a fuel. A food is probably much more than what we understand what it is. So let's start this. I want to know from you people as to what you think is a food. How would you define a food? Anyone here? Please. I'm sure you know the answers. Much better than I do. Just say, what do you think a food is? How do you define a food? Supposing somebody from Mars comes to you, suddenly lands and says, how do you people live? Or whatever. And you say, we have food. And he says, what is food? Tell me. How would you describe that? Can somebody say something about it?
Fuel for the body.
Fuel for the body. There you are, that's already one. So you got the fuel part of it. It's very important. Is there anything else that you say as to what food is? Sorry? Nutritious substance. So already we now have a second facet of food. We've started with the fuel function. Now somebody else is saying, hey, there is also nutrition. Let's see if there is any other facet to food. Do you have anything else? Any other ideas about food?
It supports the physiological needs of the body.
It's supposed to?
Physiological needs of the body.
Physiological needs. Now, she's getting into the health aspects and she says it also does something to the physiological needs. We'll look into them and see what they do. So, we started with fuel, which is very good. Then we went to nutrition and now we are on to physiological. Already you see that there are at least 3 facets to food. Let's see more. There must be more, right? Because food is something that's everywhere. Food is what we really want to live for sometimes. Food is something that drives all of us. Food is something that everybody craves for. We know we can't live without food. So food is in the center of this world. So it can't just have 3 definitions. It has to be more. Food has always been there for millions of years. So what's so great about food? And I think you start by getting some kind of definitions of food, trying to understand the facets of food. That is what a food scientist should do first of all. Because normally, as food scientists, we look at the chemistry, we look at the technology, and we just put on blinkers, and we look at the fuel part, we look at the nutrition part, and we look at the physiological parts even. But can a food be more than that? As the Oxford Dictionary says, any nutritious substance that people or animals suddenly, they don't talk about cars, so the fuel doesn't work that well, but certainly it goes from human beings to animals, eat or drink, or then we come down to the plants, which absorb in order to maintain life and growth. So there are 2 key parameters here that you've already seen. One is to live, you need food, and then to grow, you need food. So at least these 2 parameters are important. And then we said, but then it should also give us nutrition. But nutrition is within that growth. The physiological needs are within that growth. Is there anything else that can be interesting about food? Is it all about eating to live because you can't do otherwise? And then you want to grow. Does it stop there? No. Food is everywhere, and food is everything in our life. Take these other perspectives of food. Food is tradition. So you say, hey, I come from Chettinad, and that place has got a tradition of food that actually is a motivator for me because I associate myself with that place. And as a company selling food, I can then say, hey, I can use that tradition of this food, the facet of this food, to actually market my food better. Because this consumer does not just want to grow and live. No, this consumer also wants to live happily. And so, some part of that happiness, this food can bring. And that is a tradition that food can bring. So, already you have one indicator that it's not just the physiological, the fuel, and the nutrition needs, which are, of course, very important, but there are other needs. Then, what else are the other facets? You can go on and on and on. Culture. Food is part of the culture. Almost all cultures have their own foods. In India, you know that there is such a diverse culture, but then you ought to say diverse culture of food, basically, because every culture is almost defined by its food habits first, the language they speak second. These two actually define a culture in most places. And so you see in a place like Europe, you have small countries, Belgium, Netherlands, even Luxembourg. They all have their own food cultures, even today, and they maintain it. So the food and the culture part go very strongly with each other. So once again, if you're a food scientist, you need to understand that hey, I need to understand that I'm actually not just catering to as a fuel or just to grow or just to live. No, it's a lot more than that. I'm catering to the tradition, I'm catering to the culture part. But the culture itself is a very widely used terminology and you have it everywhere. So you take a country like the US. What is happening there? You see that the companies around, the food companies, they're actually trying to harmonize that culture. Why do you think an American going out wants to go to a McDonald's? Not because it's cheap, not because it's particularly tasty, it's because that's the culture he was brought up in. And he knows what he's going to get. So when he gets into a McDonald's outlet, he knows that the bun is going to taste like this, the burger is going to taste like this, the fries are going to taste, and they are uniform and they are the same. So what actually McDonald's has done, most importantly, is to ensure in the consumer's mind, in your mind, in my mind, that don't worry, whenever you step into a McDonald's, you will get the same burger. Now that is the culture that we are talking about. So human beings want to associate themselves with a culture. And this is a McDonald's culture that they've created. Just like when, I don't know how many of you are from the south of India. How many? Can you raise your hands? Wow, okay. And how many from the east of India? Nobody? Yes, there are. From the north? There are people here. And from the west? No one? Okay. But as you know that each of these regions of India have their own cultures. And do you know one of the most important problems that people coming from one region to the other have today? It's about the food. It's about the food culture. So when I move from here, if I'm a Tamilian or I'm a South Indian, I move to Delhi, one of my first problems is to get used to that food. Now, if it is a fuel, if it's only for physiological needs and if it's only as a nutrition, I should do that. It's the same potato, same calories. But I don't. Why? Because that's not the culture I was brought up with. And so it's very important for, as a food scientist, to understand that. And many food scientists don't take this into account when they go for their first job. They go in and say, oh, I know all the technologies. I know fermentation, I know how to measure this bacteria, I know everything. And then the marketing guys come and say, no, you're not going to do any of those. This is a very soft processed product, so you don't process it at all. And so you don't understand why. But then that customer wants it only that way because his culture is different. So what you need to understand is not just the supply end of food, as I call it, which is its basic functions, but also its numerous facets. Now, food can also be a poison. That shocks you, right? There's a proverb in Tamil. I'm from Tamil Nadu. It says anything in excess can be a poison. And food actually has been proven almost to be a poison in the US. So if you take the US, what happened was till about the 2000s, the government actually promoted cheap food because they wanted people to get cheap food. It was almost called the economic legislation, by which the government told all the big companies, go ahead and make cheap food, we'll protect you, because the consumer has got to get cheap food. What happened? You know what happened. They all got obese in large numbers. The government's bills for medicine increased. They were in debt trouble. So come 2000, the government says, oops, I've made a mistake. I must change. And what do? I must have some kind of a social legislation by which I say, make sure that nutrition is an integral part of that. So even the US government has got it wrong when it started to look at its food policy. So you've got to be very careful when you define food and what its functions are. Now, having taken you through that little market for food, you know that food, you can get it, as I said, at home. You can cook it at home. Or you can go to the restaurant. Or you can go to the retail shop and buy food. And that food in the retail shop is made in a factory. So when you come to a factory, you find some food there being made. Let's take a soup. When the consumer actually consumes that soup, it's exactly like the soup that he or she prepares at home. But he doesn't even know that it may not be anything to do with the preparation that he has made in the kitchen. The two products are entirely different. They're almost like infant formula and mother's milk. So when you go to a factory and start to make food, often you should not really worry about how it's made at home, probably. What you should be bothered about is, what kind of product is it? How do I deliver it? And hence, working backwards, how do I start producing it in the factory? This is a very, very different approach. Often you find, for the same product that's cooked at home and at the factory, the raw materials may be different. Basic raw materials. The processing is completely different. The shelf life is different. Everything is different. So, you need to be aware that a processed food is a very different product from a food that's made at home. So, if you were to define what I call as processed food, the definition is that foods that have been treated or prepared by a special method, especially in order to preserve them. So one of the key aspects of a processed food, in which most of you will be involved over a period of time, is what is called a shelf life. Now, when you want to cook food at home, you can cook, but it doesn't keep for long. You know that. You can keep it for 1 day, 2 days in the refrigerator. After that, you can't keep it. Whereas, a processed food in general is supposed to last that long. So you have many examples of processed foods versus homemade foods where that shelf life or the life of the product makes all the difference, right? So you have now the whole definition of foods versus processed foods. And what you will be focusing on in your lives is not more with processed foods, but all the time keeping the general foods at the back of your minds. That's what you'll be working on. The model is your food, but what you will be making probably is a completely different product, which you will have to help the consumer understand and be honest about it and communicate all the benefits and the differences over regularly cooked food. And it's the biggest challenge that the industry faces today across the world, right? So, if you were to then go and look at foods in India generally, what we have tried to do here is classify food according to the time you eat that food. In general, you have a breakfast food that can consist of non-Indian foods, breakfast cereals, for example, bread, it can be various other products. On the other hand, it can also be local Indian foods. It can be an idli or whatever you take, parathas, whatever. Then you have a lunch or dinner, the two major meals. You have a separate section called snacks, which is an in-between meal. That is, it's between lunch and dinner or breakfast and lunch, invariably. You have desserts, which are sweets, and they normally tend to be classified in snacks in India, but abroad you tend to put them in a different category because invariably after dinner you eat a dessert. And finally, the beverages, which just go right through the day. So these are more or less the kind of foods that you consume, and this is going to be the case for all of you. You'll be working more or less on all these kinds of products. What is interesting is, when you look at foods in India, what you're saying is there are foods which are Indian and there are foods which are non-Indian. For example, an instant noodle is a non-Indian food, right? Whereas a paratha or a chapati is your Indian food. Now, when you take the plethora of Indian foods that are available across the country, you see that in every single culture, they cater to all these categories that we have here, right across all these categories. You can find products. You can find products for all these, except that you may not find the products in a retail shop yet, but you do find them in the kitchen, and in almost all the cases, you find it in the food service, by which I mean the restaurants, for example. So what we are saying now is, as far as India is concerned, we have got a